John Simmons never expected his life to take such a turn. After serving 15 years in the Army, including 2 deployments to Afghanistan, he thought he had seen it all: chaos, loss, and the raw, unfiltered reality of war. But nothing could have prepared him for what he found on that bitter December morning. It was the day after Christmas, and the air was thick with silence, the kind that only a heavy snowfall could bring. John had retreated to his remote cabin in Montana, a place he'd bought with his savings and a desperate hope for peace. The towering pines stood frozen under the weight of the snow, and the only sounds were the soft crunches of his boots as he trudged along the edge of his property. He didn't expect to see anything or anyone out here, but there it was. At first, he thought it was just a dark mound in the snow, maybe a fallen tree branch or a discarded tarp blown in by the wind. But as he got closer, he saw the trembling form of a German shepherd curled up, half buried under the weight of the snow. Her fur was matted with ice, and her ribs jutted out in sharp contrast against her thin frame. She was barely breathing. John's instincts kicked in. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands automatically reaching out to check for a pulse. The dog's eyes fluttered open, and for a split second, there was fear in them. Fear John knew all too well. That deep, primal kind of fear that comes from being abandoned and left to fend for yourself. "Hey there, girl," he whispered, his voice cracking in the cold. "You're okay now." The thought of leaving her there never crossed his mind. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his thick parka and wrapped it around her shivering body, lifting her carefully into his arms. She was lighter than she should have been, and that bothered him more than he was willing to admit. As he carried her back to the cabin, flashes of his past flooded his mind. Images of his old military K-9 unit, the dogs that had saved his life more times than he could count. One, in particular, haunted him still: Ranger, his trusted partner who had taken the brunt of an IED blast meant for him. John had never been able to forgive himself for it. "Not this time," he muttered under his breath, his jaw tightening. "Not again." Inside the cabin, he set the dog down by the fireplace and got to work. First a dry towel, then warm water, and finally an old army blanket he hadn't touched in years. The dog barely moved, letting him work in silence. But when he placed a bowl of warm broth in front of her, her nose twitched, and a flicker of life returned to her eyes. "Good girl," John said softly, watching as she lapped at the liquid, each slow movement proof that she was still fighting. As the hours passed, John found himself talking to her, telling her stories he hadn't told another soul in years. Maybe it was the loneliness, or maybe it was the fact that he saw a reflection of himself in her. Abandoned, beaten down, but not entirely broken. He decided to call her Ghost. By nightfall, Ghost was sitting up, her ears flicking at every sound. There was something sharp and intelligent in her gaze, and it unsettled John in a way he couldn't explain. She wasn't just a stray. Someone had trained her, and whoever had left her out here had done it on purpose. A dark knot formed in his gut. The next morning, John loaded up his truck and drove into town. There wasn't much to Kalispell, just a diner, a gas station, and an old vet clinic that doubled as the town's gossip hub. Doc Reynolds, the grizzled old veterinarian, took one look at Ghost and frowned. "Where'd you find her?" he asked, running a careful hand over the dog's flank. "By the North Ridge," John replied, watching for a reaction. Reynolds' face darkened. "She's chipped. Belongs to someone. Question is, why'd they dump her out there?" John felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had a feeling he wasn't going to like the answer. John sat in the vet clinic's waiting room, his foot tapping against the tile floor as Doc Reynolds scanned Ghost's microchip. The soft hum of the machine filled the silence, and John's mind raced with questions. Who would abandon a well-trained dog like her? And why out here in the middle of nowhere? "There it is," Reynolds muttered, squinting at the screen. His eyes flickered with something that John immediately recognized. Concern. "This dog. She's registered to a guy named Malcolm Trenton. Lives about 40 miles east of here, near Flathead Lake." John frowned. The name didn't ring a bell, but he had a bad feeling gnawing at his gut. "That mean anything to you, Doc?" Reynolds sighed, taking off his glasses and rubbing his eyes. Trenton's trouble. Came into town a few years back, talking big about security contracts and K-9 training. Heard he was working with some shady folks, private military types, you know the kind. Not exactly the neighborly type. He glanced at Ghost, who was resting her head on John's boot. If she was his dog and he left her out there, it wasn't by accident. John's jaw clenched. He didn't like the sound of this. He had seen too many men like Trenton. Men who thought life was disposable, animals included. "So what do we do?" he asked, his voice low. Reynolds leaned back in his chair. "Legally, we call animal control, let them handle it." He paused. "But if you're asking me what you should do, keep her close. Something tells me whoever left her in that snow didn't expect her to be found." John nodded, his decision made. "She stays with me." Back at the cabin, Ghost was settling in. She had taken to John quickly, following him from room to room, watching his every move with those intelligent, amber eyes. It was unnerving, almost like she was waiting for something, or someone. That night, as John sat by the fire with a glass of whiskey in hand, he found himself opening up again. He talked to her about the war, about the sleepless nights, about the ghosts he carried inside him. Ghost listened, ears flicking, head tilting slightly at certain words. It was comforting in a way he hadn't felt in years. But something still didn't sit right. John's instincts told him that finding Ghost wasn't just luck. The way she'd been left in that spot, too far from town, yet too close to his property, felt deliberate. And if Trenton was the kind of guy Doc Reynolds hinted at, then this might not be over. He double-checked the locks before heading to bed, an old habit from his military days. Ghost lay curled up at the foot of the bed, but her ears remained perked, alert. John fell into a restless sleep, but in the middle of the night, something stirred him awake. A sound, a low growl. John's eyes snapped open, his hand instinctively reaching under the pillow for his pistol. Ghost was standing by the door, her body tense, fur bristling. She let out another growl, this time deeper, more menacing. John moved silently to the window and peered outside. At first, there was nothing, just the soft glow of moonlight on the snow. But then he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. John's pulse quickened. He recognized the stance, military. Whoever it was, they weren't lost hikers. They were watching. Ghost let out a low whine, her tail flicking anxiously. John whispered, "Easy, girl. We're not alone, are we?" The figure lingered for another few seconds before disappearing into the woods. John stayed by the window, gripping his gun tightly, every nerve in his body on high alert. Morning couldn't come soon enough. Traction, speeding back onto the forest road. In the mirror, he saw the men giving chase on foot before disappearing into the trees. "Looks like they really want you back," he said to Ghost, breath coming in ragged gulps. Ghost didn't flinch. She just watched him with those sharp eyes, almost as if she was telling him, "We're not done yet." John didn't know where this road was taking him, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to turn Ghost over. Not now. Not ever. John's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing through every possible scenario. He'd been in tight spots before, ambushes in Afghanistan, hostage extractions in hostile territory, but this felt different. This was personal. Ghost sat alert in the passenger seat, eyes locked on the road ahead. She seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, her ears twitching at every sound outside the truck. The way she reacted, it was almost as if she expected an attack at any moment. John checked the rearview mirror again. No sign of the men who had been shooting at them, but he knew they weren't far behind. He needed a plan. Fast. "All right, girl," he muttered under his breath. "Let's figure this out before we end up in a ditch." He reached for his phone and dialed the only person he could trust, Ethan Caldwell, an old army buddy who had transitioned into private security work after their last tour together. The phone rang twice before Ethan's voice came on, groggy but alert. "Simmons? You do know it's 6 in the morning, right?" John didn't waste time. "Need a favor. Got a situation with an ex-military contractor guy named Trenton. He's after a dog I found out in the snow. This thing's bigger than it looks. There was a long pause. Trenton, Ethan's voice was suddenly serious. Yeah, I've heard of him. He's bad news. Rumors say he was running illegal K-9 programs. Drug operations, smuggling, even assassinations using trained dogs. John swore under his breath. Makes sense. Ghost isn't just a stray. She's trained, Ethan. Tactical. Someone dumped her near my cabin, probably hoping nature would take care of her. Ethan exhaled sharply. Where are you now? Heading south on 93. Think they're tailing me? All right, Ethan said, his voice all business now. Get off the main roads, head toward the old ranger station near Bitterroot Pass. It's off-grid. I can meet you there in a couple of hours. But be careful. If Trenton wants that dog, he's not going to stop coming. John hung up and glanced at Ghost. Looks like we're taking the scenic route. The snow-covered back roads were treacherous, but John knew them well enough. He kept his speed steady, eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. Ghost, sensing the tension, remained still but alert, occasionally letting out a low whine. About 20 miles in, just as the sun began to peek over the mountains, John noticed something off. A black SUV parked along the roadside, partially hidden by the trees. He slowed down, narrowing his eyes. The engine was still warm, the exhaust barely visible in the freezing air. Not good, he muttered. Just as he passed it, the SUV's headlights flicked on, and the vehicle roared to life, pulling onto the road behind him. Damn it! John slammed the gas pedal down, the truck kicking up snow as it sped down the winding road. The SUV followed close, headlights flashing in his mirror. He took a sharp turn, tires skidding slightly, but he kept control. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from behind. Bullets shattered the rear windshield, and John instinctively ducked, gripping the wheel tighter. Ghost barked furiously, her body tensed with adrenaline. Hang on, girl! He jerked the truck onto a narrow logging road, weaving between towering pines as the SUV struggled to follow. The road was rough, filled with dips and fallen branches, but John pushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. A loud pop echoed through the truck. One of the tires had blown. Perfect, he growled through clenched teeth. With no choice left, John slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a jarring halt. Ghost sprang out the moment he opened the door, her instincts on high alert. John grabbed his rifle from the back seat and took cover behind a fallen tree. The SUV screeched to a stop a few yards away, and two men in tactical gear jumped out, weapons drawn. John didn't hesitate. He fired off two quick shots, forcing them to take cover behind their vehicle. Ghost, sensing the opportunity, darted forward with lightning speed, circling around through the trees. John took a deep breath and called out, "You boys sure you want to do this?" A voice shouted back, "Just give us the dog, Simmons. Walk away while you can." John smirked, peering down the sights of his rifle. "Yeah, that's not gonna happen." A sharp bark rang out, and Ghost burst from the trees, lunging at one of the men. Her jaws clamped down on his arm, dragging him to the ground with surprising force. The second man panicked and fired wildly, but John took him down with a well-placed shot to the leg. Ghost released the first attacker as John rushed forward, securing him with a firm kick to the ribs. The man groaned, clutching his bleeding arm. "Who sent you?" John demanded, rifle pressed against the guy's chest. He spat blood onto the snow and chuckled. "You already know." John scowled. He didn't need more answers, he needed to get out of there. "We're leaving," he muttered to Ghost, who wagged her tail proudly as if she had just won a prize. Dragging the injured man's gun away, John hurried back to the truck. The blown tire wouldn't last, but it would get them a few more miles. Ghost jumped into the passenger seat, panting but alert. John ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. "We're really in it now, girl." He turned the ignition, praying the truck had one more fight left in it. John's truck limped down the narrow forest road, the blown tire thudding against the snow-packed ground. He could feel the clock ticking in his head. Trenton's men wouldn't stay down for long. Ghost sat rigid in the passenger seat, her eyes locked on the road ahead, as if she could sense the danger still lurking behind them. The old ranger station wasn't far now, maybe another 10 miles. If they could just make it there, Ethan would have backup waiting. But John had been in the game long enough to know things never went that smoothly. As if on cue, headlights appeared in the distance behind him. "Damn it," he muttered. "They don't quit, do they?" Ghost let out a low growl, ears flat against her head. John tightened his grip on the wheel and pressed the accelerator, pushing the battered truck to its limit. The SUV behind him was closing fast, and this time they weren't messing around. Shots rang out, shattering the side mirror and embedding into the door. John cursed and swerved, barely keeping control on the icy road. "Hold on, girl," he shouted, gripping the wheel tighter. He spotted an old, abandoned lumber yard up ahead, just off the road. A perfect place to make a stand. He veered off abruptly, plowing through the snow and sliding to a stop behind a row of rusted-out trucks. The pursuing SUV followed suit, tires screeching to a halt. John jumped out, rifle at the ready, using the old vehicles for cover. Ghost was already in position, crouching low beside him, waiting for his command. "Come on, then," John muttered under his breath, scanning the tree line. The men were smart, they fanned out, using the trees for cover as they moved in. John counted at least 4 of them, their silhouettes shifting through the falling snow. He took the first shot, dropping one of them with a clean hit to the shoulder. The others ducked and returned fire, forcing John to hunker down behind the rusted truck. Ghost's ears perked, and before John could stop her, she bolted around the side, disappearing into the shadows. "Ghost, no!" John hissed, but she was already gone. A second later, a scream echoed through the air. John peeked around the corner in time to see Ghost lunging at another attacker, knocking him flat into the snow. The remaining men panicked, firing wildly as they retreated toward their SUV. John didn't waste the opportunity. He took careful aim and fired, hitting the rear tire of their vehicle. The SUV sagged under its weight, wheels spinning uselessly in the snow. "Looks like you're walking home," John called out, stepping forward with his rifle aimed steady. The remaining men, realizing they were outmatched, dropped their weapons and raised their hands. John approached cautiously, keeping his gun trained on them. "Tell Trenton he's not getting his damn dog back. She's mine now." One of the men, breathing heavily, muttered, "You don't get it, Simmons. It's not just a dog. It's what she knows." John frowned. "What are you talking about?" The man coughed, blood staining the snow beneath him. "Ghost. She was trained for something big. Recon. Surveillance. She's got data encoded in her behavioral patterns, responses. She's got things buried in her memory that Trenton's clients would kill to keep quiet." John's stomach dropped. "You're telling me she's got classified intel stored in her training?" The man nodded weakly. "You have no idea what you're into." John stood there for a moment, processing. Ghost, sitting by his side now, nuzzled against his leg as if to remind him that she trusted him with her life. And he wasn't about to let anyone take her away. He grabbed the nearest man by the collar and shoved him toward the truck. "Go. Tell Trenton he's lost." They didn't need to be told twice. The men stumbled back to their wrecked SUV and disappeared into the forest, leaving John and Ghost standing in the cold silence. By the time John reached the ranger station, Ethan was already there, leaning against his truck with a rifle slung over his shoulder. "Damn, Simmons," he said with a grin. "You sure know how to attract trouble." John chuckled dryly, ruffling Ghost's fur. "Yeah, well, trouble found me this time." Ethan eyed the dog. "She's special, isn't she?" John nodded. "More than I thought. But she's staying with me." Ethan sighed. "You know they're not going to stop looking, right?" John glanced down at Ghost, who looked back at him with those sharp, unwavering eyes. "Let 'em come. We'll be ready." John sat on the porch of his cabin a week later, watching Ghost chase after a stick in the snow. She was different now, more relaxed, more at home, and so was he. In saving her, he'd found something he hadn't realized he'd lost: purpose. Looking down at the steaming cup of coffee in his hands, he muttered, "Sometimes you don't choose your battles. They choose you." Ghost trotted back, dropping the stick at his feet with a wag of her tail. John smiled. And sometimes, the best partners find you when you least expect it. He had learned that life could take unexpected turns, but with the right companions, loyal, fierce, and unwavering, he could face anything. John knew he wasn't the only one who had been lost, looking for something to hold on to. His advice to anyone facing their own battles? Trust your instincts. Don't run from the things that scare you. And when you find something worth fighting for, don't ever let it go.